The morning Evelyn Harper was supposed to become a wife, Gerald Holt looked her up and down in front of everyone gathered at the Harper farm and laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind a man swallows out of decency. He let it out full and open, the way a man laughs when he's certain no one in the room will stop him. You honestly expect someone to take that to Wyoming? He said it to her father, not to her, as if she were a piece of livestock being assessed for transport. Nathan Cole must be more desperate than I thought. Her mother went still. Her younger sister looked away. The neighbors who'd come to wish Evelyn well found sudden interest in their shoes. Evelyn stood in the yard with her travel bag at her feet and said nothing. Her face did not break. But something behind her eyes went very quiet, the way a fire goes quiet before it decides what it's going to burn. If you've ever been spoken about like you weren't standing right there, if you've ever had someone measure your worth out loud while you were still breathing, then you already know what that moment cost her. Stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next, because what Evelyn builds from that moment will leave you speechless. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Harper farm had been failing for 3 years before anyone admitted it out loud. Evelyn knew it before her father did, or at least before he was willing to say so. She'd been keeping the household accounts since she was 17, and the numbers had a way of telling the truth even when people didn't want to hear it. Bad grain harvest in the summer of 1881. A cattle illness that took 11 head the following spring. A loan from Gerald Holt, taken out in a moment of desperation, with terms her father hadn't read carefully enough. Gerald Holt was the kind of man who wore his money like a second coat. He owned the largest mercantile operation in Calhoun County, Missouri, and he had a habit of buying things, land, debts, people's futures, when they were at their lowest value. He wasn't cruel in the theatrical sense. He didn't twist his mustache or raise his voice. He simply waited and smiled and let the arithmetic do his dirty work for him. The loan had come due 6 weeks ago. Her father had gone to Holt's office with his hat in his hand and asked for an extension. Holt had given him one, but the terms of that extension included a rider her father hadn't caught, something buried in the third paragraph about the eastern pasture reverting to Holt's possession if the debt wasn't settled by the 1st of October. Evelyn had found the document 3 nights later, reading by lamplight while her father slept. She'd sat with it for a long time. Then she'd folded it carefully, put it back where she found it, and gone to bed without sleeping. She didn't tell her father what she'd seen, not because she wanted to protect him from it, he would have to know eventually, but because she needed time to think. Evelyn had learned early that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. When you were a woman who looked the way she did, the world was already watching for any sign that you couldn't handle things. She'd spent 26 years refusing to give them that satisfaction. The option had come from an unlikely place. A letter, delivered to the county post office in late August, addressed to the Harper family in general. It had been written by a man named Elias Burke, a land agent operating out of Cheyenne, Wyoming, on behalf of a rancher named Nathan Cole. The letter explained in plain and businesslike language that Mr. Cole was seeking a wife. He was 41 years old, had operated a cattle ranch in the Bighorn Basin for 11 years, and required a woman of practical disposition rather than delicate temperament. He was not, the letter made clear, looking for a romantic arrangement. He was looking for a partner who could manage a household and help him run a working property. The letter had been sitting on the kitchen table for 2 weeks when Evelyn picked it up and read it properly for the first time. Her mother had dismissed it immediately. A stranger, from Wyoming. We don't know anything about this man. We know he's honest enough to say what he's actually looking for, Evelyn said. Her mother gave her the look, the particular combination of worry and pity that Evelyn had been receiving her entire life. Evelyn. I'm 26, Mama. I'm not going to pretend that's not what it is. She wasn't naive about it. She understood perfectly well that she was not the first name on any man's list, and hadn't been for years. She was large. That was the word people used when they were being polite, and there were plenty of other words when they weren't. She'd overheard them her whole life, at church socials and county fairs and the dry goods store. She'd learned to keep her face smooth and her posture straight and her opinions measured, because the moment a woman like her showed any strong feeling in public, people took it as confirmation of whatever they already thought about her. She had feelings, of course. She was not a cabinet, but she'd gotten good at choosing when and where to put them. The letter from Wyoming sat with her for 3 more days. Then she read the loan document again. Then she sat down and wrote a reply to Elias Burke. She did not tell her family until the answer came back. Gerald Holt found out before her mother did, which was the thing that bothered Evelyn most, looking back. Calhoun County was small, the post office was smaller, and Holt had his fingers in most of the information that moved through both. By the time the confirmation letter arrived from Cheyenne, Holt had already decided that Evelyn's departure represented a problem for him. He came to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, with 2 of his hired men standing behind him like punctuation. Her father met him at the gate. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, and something in the set of Holt's shoulders told her this wasn't a social call. She went outside. "Miss Harper," Holt said, turning to her with the particular smile he used when he wanted something, "I hear congratulations are in order." "I don't know what you've heard," she said. "Wyoming," he said. "Nathan Cole's place. Word travels." She said nothing. She had learned that silence made men like Holt uncomfortable, and discomfort made them say things they hadn't planned to. He said it anyway. "Here's my concern. With you leaving, your father's going to be short-handed. And given the current state of the account between us—" "The account," her father started. "Is being settled," Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. "The arrangement I've made includes a settlement. Mr. Cole's agent will be forwarding a sum to cover the outstanding balance. You'll receive it before the 1st of October. She had negotiated that herself in the 3rd letter she'd written to Elias Burke. She'd been direct about it. Her family had a debt, and she needed it handled as part of the arrangement. Burke had gone back to Cole, and Cole had agreed without apparent objection. She still wasn't sure what to make of that. Holt's smile didn't waver, but something behind it shifted. He looked at her the way people did when they suddenly realized they'd underestimated a situation. "Well," he said, "practical girl." He left. Her father didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood at the gate staring at the road where Holt's wagon had gone. "You should have told me," he finally said. "I know. I'm sorry. You negotiated this yourself." "Yes." He turned and looked at her, and his face was complicated, embarrassed and grateful and something else she couldn't quite name. "Evelyn, the farm needs the debt cleared," she said. "This clears it. That's what matters." He didn't argue, but he also didn't quite look at her the rest of that evening, and she understood it wasn't anger. It was the harder thing. A father realizing his daughter had spent years quietly managing problems he hadn't known were being managed. The neighbors found out over the following week, the way news always found its way through a small county. Not through any announcement, but through the natural drift of gossip from one kitchen to another. And the gossip was not kind. It was Mrs. Aldrich from the farm down the road who said, loud enough to be heard at the feed store, that it was a shame what a girl had to do when she had no other options. It was Tom Carver, who'd been in Evelyn's Sunday school class 20 years ago, who made the joke about Nathan Cole ordering a bride sight unseen and getting more than he bargained for. It was a dozen small cruelties, mostly, of the type that people tell themselves don't count because they're said behind someone's back rather than to their face. But Evelyn heard most of them. Small counties were like that. She packed her trunk with efficiency rather than feeling. 2 wool dresses, a cotton dress, her warmest coat, practical boots, her mother's spare quilting needles, 3 books, 2 on agricultural management, 1 a history of the Wyoming territory she'd ordered special from the county seat, and the small wooden box where she kept her household accounts. She was not a romantic, or at least she had spent enough years being practical that she'd lost track of the distinction. She did not pack anything she couldn't justify. The morning of her departure, the Holt incident happened. Gerald Holt had arrived at the farm again. She thought afterward that he must have planned it, timed it deliberately for maximum audience, because there were already 6 or 7 neighbors gathered to see her off. Her parents, her younger sister Clara, old Mrs. Warren from next door, who always cried at departures, and Holt, with 2 of his men again, coming through the gate with an air of casual authority that made Evelyn's jaw tighten before he'd said a word. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her. He did the laugh. "You honestly expect someone to take that to Wyoming?" The yard went quiet. Her mother put a hand over her mouth. Clara's face went white with fury, and Evelyn caught her sister's arm before Clara could step forward, because Clara had a temper, and the last thing Evelyn needed right now was a scene she couldn't control. "Nathan Cole must be more desperate than I thought," Holt finished. He was grinning at her father, man to man, like this was a joke they were sharing. Her father started to speak. Evelyn let go of Clara's arm. She picked up her travel bag. She walked to the gate, stopped in front of Holt, and looked at him. Not up. She was nearly his height. And not with anger, because anger was what he wanted. She looked at him the way you look at arithmetic that doesn't quite add up. Mr. Holt, she said, your debt has been settled. Your opinion of me has no further value in this transaction. I'd appreciate it if you'd move out of the way. He blinked, just once. Then he stepped to the side. She walked past him to the waiting wagon without looking back. Clara cried. Her mother cried. Her father shook her hand rather than hugging her, which was his way, and she felt the grip of it, the apology in it, the pride in it, the grief in it all compressed together. She climbed up beside the wagon driver, and the farm receded behind her, and she did not let herself cry until they had rounded the first bend and the road had closed off the view. Even then, it was only for a moment. She had work to do. The train journey from Missouri to Wyoming took 4 days with transfers, and Evelyn spent most of it reading. The agricultural book first. She'd read it twice already, but wanted to review the sections on high-altitude cattle grazing, since the Bighorn Basin was considerably higher and colder than anything she knew from Missouri. The Wyoming Territory history second, not for comfort, but for information. She filled 12 pages of a small notebook with notes on water rights, land claims, the history of cattle operations in the territory, the names of the major ranching families. She was not building a fantasy, she was building a foundation. The woman in the seat across from her on the second leg of the journey, a widow from Illinois, well-dressed, clearly unused to the Western trains, watched Evelyn write for an hour before asking what she was working on. Research, Evelyn said. For school? For a ranch I'm going to be running. The woman blinked. Oh, you're going to Wyoming to work on a ranch? I'm going to Wyoming to help run one. I'm getting married. Oh, the woman said again, and her eyes did the thing. The involuntary assessment, up and down, the small adjustment of expectation. How lovely, she said, in a tone that meant something different. Evelyn turned back to her notebook. She arrived in Cheyenne on a Thursday afternoon, took a room at the hotel the agent had arranged, and met Elias Burke for breakfast the following morning. He was a small, precise man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades mediating between people who didn't entirely trust each other. He told her what she needed to know about Nathan Cole without embellishment. He's not an easy man, Burke said. I want to be clear about that. He's fair, from what I've seen, but he's not warm. Lost a wife 8 years ago, child same year. He doesn't talk about it and doesn't want anyone else talking about it. He runs a tight operation, but it's been struggling. Prices dropped 2 years ago, and he's been behind on his supply contract since. He needs someone who can manage the domestic side of the operation so he can focus on the cattle. That's what he told me to tell you. What else didn't he tell you to tell me? Evelyn asked. Burke looked at her over his coffee cup. He told me to tell you the house needs work. The previous housekeeper left in March and nobody's replaced her. He said it's, his words, not what a woman would expect. I'm not going there to be comfortable, she said. I'm going there to work. Burke nodded, and she thought he looked slightly relieved, though he covered it quickly. He'll meet you at the Clearwater station on Saturday. There's a supply run he has to make, so the timing works. His hand, a man named Deke Halverson, will drive you out to the ranch from there. She took the northbound stage on Friday, which was 8 hours on a road that apparently hadn't been maintained since the previous decade, judging by how it felt. The landscape changed in ways that would have been beautiful if she hadn't been so focused on not losing her balance. Flatter, then rolling, then dramatic, the mountains appearing in the distance like something that had always been there, quietly waiting to be noticed. Clearwater was smaller than she'd expected. Main Street, a handful of buildings, a post office, a general store with a porch where 3 men were sitting when the stage pulled in. The men looked at the stage. The stage driver helped her down with her trunk. The men on the porch watched her land on the wooden walkway, and there was the particular beat of silence that she'd learned to recognize, the pause while people recalibrated. A lean man in his mid-40s came out of the general store just then, and she knew without being told that it was Nathan Cole. Not because he was handsome, he was, in a worn, weathered way, with the kind of face that had been outside in every season for 20 years, but because of how he carried himself. careful, watchful, like a man who had learned not to be surprised and wasn't entirely sure he'd succeeded. He stopped when he saw her. She'd braced for it, the flicker, the reassessment. She'd gotten very good at seeing it, and it was there, briefly, but he moved through it faster than most. He came down the steps and crossed the walkway and held out his hand. Miss Harper. Mr. Cole. His handshake was brief and businesslike. He had calloused hands and a faint scar across the back of his left one that she didn't ask about. He wasn't looking at her the way Holt had looked at her, not sizing her up as a liability. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he's trying to figure out something that matters. Stage was on time, he said. About 20 minutes late out of Casper, she said. But it made it up. He nodded. Deke will take you out to the ranch. I've got another hour here for supplies. He paused. The house is... There's a room made up. It's the front bedroom. I took the back. All right. It's a long drive. I read on trains, she said. I'll manage. He looked at her again, that careful look, and then he nodded and went back up the steps into the store. One of the men on the porch was watching her with open curiosity. Another had the careful, neutral expression of someone withholding judgment. The third, an older man with a gray beard, was looking at her with something that was almost sympathy, and that bothered her more than the other looks. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted to get to work. Deke Halverson was a man of about 60, built like a post, with a face that had never wasted much expression. He loaded her trunk into the wagon with efficient competence and helped her up to the seat without comment, which she appreciated. He didn't try to make conversation on the drive out, which she also appreciated, though she offered once to talk if he wanted. Don't much, he said. Fair enough. They drove in comfortable silence for 2 hours, and Evelyn looked out at the land. She was building a picture of it in her mind, the grass, the slope of the terrain, the way the water would run in spring. She was already asking questions she didn't have answers to yet. She had learned that questions were more useful than assumptions, and she had a good many to start with. The ranch came into view as the sun was getting low. It was not impressive on first sight. The main house was a solid structure but badly weathered, one of the shutters hanging at an angle. The barn was large, but the fence line she could see from the road had at least 2 obvious breaks. There was a bunkhouse to the south, and what might have been a chicken coop that had given up the pretense some time ago. She said nothing. She was noting it. The difference between those 2 things was not small. Deke helped her down at the house. He carried her trunk to the door and set it inside, said, Cole'll be back around supper time, and walked to the bunkhouse without ceremony. She stood alone in the front room of the house and looked at it. It was not what a woman would expect. That had been accurate. The kitchen was functional, but neglected. The stove needed blacking. The shelves were dusty. The curtain over the window had a long tear in it that hadn't been mended. The front bedroom was clean, barely, with a quilt on the bed that had clearly been freshly laid and a small mirror on the wall that was the only concession to anything personal. She set her bag down. She took off her coat. She put on her working apron, which she'd kept at the top of the bag for exactly this moment. She started with the stove. By the time Nathan Cole arrived back at the ranch, 3 hours later, the stove had been cleaned and blacked. A fire was going. There was a pot of beans with salt pork on. She'd found both in the pantry, which at least had been adequately stocked, and she had identified on a piece of paper she set on the kitchen table 8 things that needed immediate attention versus 14 that could wait until the following week. He came in through the back door, stopped, and looked at the kitchen. Then he looked at her. Beans will be done in 20 minutes, she said. I made a list. I'd like to go over it with you after we eat, if that's all right. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at the list without picking it up. You've been here 3 hours. 2.5. The stove took you 1.5 hours, but I wanted it done first. You can't cook properly on a neglected stove. He was quiet. She turned back to the pot and stirred it. Outside, the wind had come up and she could hear it working at the loose shutter, the same irregular bang she'd been listening to since she arrived. The shutter on the east window needs a new hinge, she said. That should probably be tomorrow, before the weather turns. How do you know the weather's turning? The grass was laying wrong on the south slope when we drove in, and the temperature dropped 8 degrees in the last hour. He was quiet again. She got 2 bowls from the shelf, she'd found them and washed them both earlier, and ladled out the beans and set one in front of him and sat down across the table with her own. "Grace?" he asked. "Not a habit of mine," she said. He seemed to take that in. Then he picked up his spoon and started eating, and she did the same, and outside the shutter banged in the wind, and inside the fire cracked in the newly blacked stove, and neither of them said anything for a while. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't what she'd feared either. After dinner, he read her list. He read it twice, which told her something about how he processed information. Then he set it down and looked at the window and said, "The fence breaks on the north pasture. That's the most urgent. I thought the shutter first, then fences. The cattle can't go anywhere they're not going already tonight. Fair. I'll need to understand your supply arrangements, how often you get into Clearwater, who your accounts are with, what your credit situation looks like." Something flickered across his face at that. Not quite resistance, but something careful. "You looking to take over the books?" "I'm looking to understand what I'm working with," she said. "I kept my family's accounts. I'm not going to do any of this blind." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. "All right," he finally said. "Tomorrow." She nodded. She cleared the bowls. He went to the back of the house, and she heard his door close, and she stood in the kitchen alone for a moment and let herself feel the exhaustion of the last 4 days, and the weight of everything she didn't know yet, and the knowledge that tomorrow it would start in earnest. Then she washed the bowls. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep well, sight. The wind, the unfamiliar sounds, the strangeness of the room. But she was up before dawn, and when Nathan Cole came out of his room at first light, she already had the coffee on. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the coffee, looked at her. "You don't have to." "I was up," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She poured. And outside, the Bighorn Basin was just starting to show the first gray light of morning over the mountains, and the ranch was quiet, and Evelyn Harper was already making a list of questions she intended to have answered before the week was out. She did not know yet what this place would become. She did not know yet who this man would turn out to be, or who she would become alongside him, or what it would cost. She knew only that she was here, and she was working, and she had never once in her life needed anyone to believe in her before she got started. She did not intend to start now. The shutter got fixed the next morning, the way she'd said it would. Nathan was up before her that day. She heard him moving in the kitchen, the particular sound of a man who'd been doing things alone for a long time and had developed a specific rhythm around it. She lay in the dark for a moment, taking stock of herself. Her back ached from the unfamiliar mattress. The wind had kept her half awake until sometime past midnight. Through the thin wall, she could hear him pouring water, setting something down on the stove with more force than he probably intended. She got up. She dressed. She came out to find him standing at the window looking at the east pasture with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk yet. "The hinge," she said. I know. I can hold the shutter if you want to do the nail work." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She poured herself a cup from the pot he'd made and drank half of it standing at the counter. "I want to understand the property. The best way to understand a property is to work it." He didn't argue. They went out into the early cold and fixed the shutter in 20 minutes, and she held the wood steady while he worked the hinge back into the frame, and neither of them spoke except for the practical exchanges. Hold it there, angle it up, one more. And afterward she stood back and looked at the house with the eyes she'd been developing since she arrived. 3 more shutters needed attention but could wait. The foundation on the northwest corner had some settling she wanted to look at more closely. The roof over the lean-to on the barn was showing daylight in at least 2 places. She was adding it all to the list she kept in her head, which was longer and more detailed than the one she'd written on paper and left on the kitchen table. She got to the books that afternoon. Nathan brought them out from wherever he'd been keeping them, a battered wooden box under a shelf in the back room, and set them on the kitchen table with the particular expression of a man presenting something he'd rather not discuss. She opened the first ledger and began reading, and he sat across from her and watched her face with the wariness of someone waiting for a verdict. It took her about 20 minutes to understand the shape of the problem. "Your supply account at Harmon's store in Clearwater," she said. "What about it?" "You're paying 10% above standard price on staples, flour, salt, lamp oil. Harmon extends credit. He extends credit and then charges you for the privilege of needing it. This isn't a line of credit, Mr. Cole, it's a penalty." She turned a page. How long has this arrangement been in place? He was quiet for a moment. 3 years, more or less. And before that? Before that, I had a wife who managed the domestic accounts, and I didn't look at them. She didn't flinch at the mention of the wife, and she didn't pretend she hadn't heard it. She simply noted it and moved on. Your cattle contract with this Billings buyer. You're selling at last year's price despite the great improvement on your spring herd. How do you know there was a great improvement? Because your feed expenditure went up 18% 2 years ago and hasn't come down, which means you changed something about how you're managing the herd. And the most likely reason a rancher increases feed cost and holds it is because he's improving the grade. She looked up. Was I wrong? He looked at her for a long moment. No. So you improved your product and kept selling it at the old price. Buyers don't volunteer better prices. No, she agreed. You have to ask for them, with documentation. She closed the ledger and set her hands flat on the cover. I want to go through everything in that box, all of it. I want to understand every account, every contract, every outstanding obligation. It'll take me a few days. And then what? And then I'll tell you where the money is going that shouldn't be, and where money should be coming in that isn't, and we'll figure out what to do about it. She picked up her coffee. You've been running this ranch like a man who's been too busy putting out fires to notice the fires coming from inside the house. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before. This one had weight. That's fairly blunt, Nathan said finally. I know. Do you want me to be less blunt? He turned the ledger over in his hands. No, he said. No, I don't think I do. The thing she hadn't expected was Deke Halverson. She'd read him as a man who kept to himself and wanted others to do the same, and that was accurate as far as it went. But she started noticing, in the first week, that he had a way of appearing at useful moments. The morning she was trying to understand how the water situation worked. There was a creek that ran on the north boundary, and a well, and the relationship between them in dry season wasn't clear to her. Deke showed up at the fence line without being asked, and spent 40 minutes explaining the layout of the property's water in the particular clipped way he had, where every sentence carried more information than it appeared to. Dry summers, the creek pulls back to here, he said, drawing a line in the dirt with the toe of his boot. Below here, it's unreliable after July. Well supplements, but can't do it alone. Has there been talk about digging a second well? Cole talked about it 4 years ago. Money was a problem. How bad is the situation in July and August typically? Deke thought about it. We've never lost cattle to it, but it gets tight. You have to move the herd earlier than you'd like. She filed it away. She was building a map of the ranch's problems in layers. The financial layer she'd started on with the ledgers, and now the operational layer, and she understood that these two things were not separate. Every operational problem had a financial consequence, and every financial constraint created operational limitations. You had to understand them together. The other ranch hands, there were 3 besides Deke, a pair of brothers named Al and Pete Swanson, and a quiet younger man called Jesse, who she thought was perhaps 20 and hadn't entirely decided what to do with himself yet, were harder to read. Al Swanson was openly skeptical of her in the way that some men were skeptical of anything that disrupted the established order of things. He didn't say anything directly rude, not in front of Nathan, but she caught the looks exchanged between him and his brother, and she heard through the thin walls one evening the word useless being used in a context that made its target clear. She didn't react. She worked. It was what she knew how to do, and she had the patience for it. She'd spent her whole life waiting for the moment when the work spoke for itself, because she'd learned early that her words rarely would. The first real test came at the end of her second week, in a form she hadn't anticipated. Nathan came in from the north pasture in the early afternoon looking like a man carrying bad news he hadn't yet figured out how to say. She was at the table working through a contract document. She'd found, at the bottom of the wooden box, a grazing lease arrangement from 3 years ago that had some language in it she wanted to understand better, and she looked up at the way he came through the door. What happened? She said. It wasn't a question. Lost 2 cows overnight. North fence has a break I didn't know about. He set his hat on the peg and stood with his back to her for a moment. They went into Aldridge's territory. She waited. Hector Aldridge is my neighbor to the north. He's had issues with cattle strain before. He's not a generous man about it. Have you talked to him? Deke went over this morning when we found the break. Aldridge says he'll return the cattle for a fee. Call it a recovery charge. How much? Nathan finally turned around. His jaw was set in the way she'd started recognizing. Not anger exactly, more the look of a man who was angry and had decided not to show it. $15 a head. She set down the contract document. That's not a recovery charge. That's a ransom. I know what it is. Have you paid it before? The pause told her the answer before he said it. Twice. Last year. $30 he'd paid the man already, on top of whatever other pressures were wearing the operation down. She thought about the ledgers. She thought about the numbers she'd been sitting with for 2 weeks. What does your property line documentation look like? What? The boundary survey. When was it last done? He frowned. When I filed the original claim, 1872. And has Aldridge disputed the line since then? He's pushed on it a couple of times, nothing formal. She stood up. I want to see the survey documents, and I want to look at the fence line where the break is. Evelyn, I'm not going to do anything rash, she said. She was already getting her coat. I want to understand what we're dealing with before you pay $15 a head to a man who's been using your fence maintenance problems as a source of income. He drove her out to the north fence line himself, which she hadn't asked for but appreciated. The break was exactly what she'd have expected. A section of old fence with wood that had simply given out, no dramatic cause, just time and weather and the weight of things leaning on it. She walked the line for 200 yards in each direction, looking at it carefully. Then she looked at the natural lay of the land, the way the slope ran, where the cattle would naturally drift, how far Aldridge's property actually was once you got past the trees. The survey stakes, she said. Are there physical markers? Should be. Iron stakes at the corners. She found one 20 minutes later, mostly buried, the red paint on it faded to almost nothing. She crouched down and looked at it carefully. Then she looked at where the fence ran relative to it. Nathan, she said, come look at this. He came and crouched beside her. She pointed at the stake, then at the fence line, then at the angle between them. Your fence is 8 to 10 feet inside your actual property line, she said. Right here. The break that lets your cattle through. They wandered onto your own land before they ever got to Aldridge's. He was very still. I'm not saying that's true for the whole line, she said. We'd need to check the other stakes. But if it holds, if someone built this fence section short of the actual survey line, then those cattle may not have been on Aldridge's property at all. Or Aldridge moved the fence. That's a possibility too. They looked at each other over the half-buried stake. I'll send a letter to the county surveyor's office in Clearwater, she said. Request a copy of the original survey documentation. In the meantime, I wouldn't pay Aldridge anything. If I don't pay, he may not return the cattle. If he doesn't return cattle that may be standing on your own property, that's a different problem than a recovery charge. That's conversion. That's a legal matter. She stood up and dusted the dirt off her knees. Pay him once more and you're telling him this strategy works. Don't pay, and you're telling him you've started paying attention. He stood up too. He was looking at her with the expression she'd started seeing more often. The careful one. The one where he was processing something he hadn't quite anticipated. You've thought about this before, property lines. My father's situation in Missouri involved a land dispute. I watched how those things go. She turned back toward the wagon. I learned that the people who win them are usually the ones who got their paperwork in order first. He didn't say anything. But when they got back to the ranch, he didn't send word to Aldridge about payment. And that evening, she sat down and wrote the letter to the county surveyor's office in precise, formal language, requesting the survey records and CCing the county land office. And she left the letter on the table for Nathan to review before she sent it. He read it. He didn't change a word. It was Deke who told her about Aldridge's history, 2 days later, in the particular roundabout way DK had of sharing information he thought she needed without quite saying he thought she needed it. They were working on the water trough repair near the west pasture. She'd asked to help with the physical work partly because she needed to learn the property, and partly because she'd found that men talked more honestly when their hands were busy. And Deke said, with his eyes on the trough, and not on her, Aldridge pushed the Kimball family off their grazing allotment 3 years ago. Boundary dispute. How'd it go? She said, fitting a board into place. Kimball's didn't have their paperwork. Aldridge did, or said he did. County sided with him. Kimball's moved on. And before them? There was a family before them. The Moores. He paused. Different situation, but same result. She thought about that. She thought about Nathan, who'd been running this land for 11 years and paying attention to the cattle and not to the documents, because that was how ranchers were. The land mattered. The paperwork felt like something someone else worried about. Has he been working toward Nathan's land? That's not for me to say, Deke said carefully, which was Deke's way of saying yes. She filed it away. The surveyor letter was already sent. She had two other things she wanted to do before she said anything more to Nathan about Aldridge. She wanted to understand the full scope of what was documented and what wasn't, and she wanted to make sure she was right before she alarmed him about something she couldn't yet prove. In the meantime, there was plenty of other work. The supply situation she addressed at the end of her second week. She asked Nathan to drive her into Clearwater, and she went to Harmon's store and introduced herself, which nobody had apparently expected. The storekeeper, a heavy-set man with small eyes and a practiced smile, had not been prepared for the woman from Cole's ranch to come in and sit across from him at his counter with a piece of paper showing the per-unit cost of staples at competing mercantiles in Casper and Cheyenne. "You're paying us a fair price for the extension of credit," Harmon started. "You're paying yourself a fair price," she said pleasantly. "There's a difference." She slid the paper across the counter. "I'm not here to argue about the past. I'm here to talk about what the account looks like going forward. Mr. Cole has been a customer here for 11 years. He'll continue to be if the terms make sense. If they don't, we'll need to make other arrangements." Harmon looked at the paper. "You'd be buying from Casper?" "I'd be buying from wherever makes sense." She kept her voice even and agreeable. "I'd prefer to keep the relationship local. It's less complicated and it keeps the money in the county, but I need the pricing to be honest." There was a long silence. She waited. She was good at waiting. "I can come down 4% on staples," Harmon finally said. 8, she said, "and keep the credit terms." They settled at 6.5, which she accepted without showing the satisfaction she felt. It wasn't the full 8, but it was a number that made a real difference compounded across a year's worth of supplies, and she'd established that she was paying attention, which was worth more than the percentage itself. Nathan had waited outside. When she came out, he looked at her and she said, "Better terms on the account. I'll explain the numbers tonight." He looked through the store window at Harmon, who was already pretending to be busy with something else. "How?" Showed him what the alternatives cost. He knew I wasn't bluffing because I wasn't. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, "My wife used to handle that kind of thing. The town accounts. She was good at it." It was the second time he'd mentioned her. Evelyn didn't press. She just nodded and went to climb up to the wagon seat, and she heard him follow, and they drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light without talking much, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. The trouble with Al Swanson came ahead on a Wednesday. She'd asked to be shown the cattle herd, the actual herd in the pasture, not just the numbers in the ledger, and Deke had taken her out on horseback, which had produced a certain amount of spectacle since she hadn't been on a horse in several years, and the process of getting her onto one was not graceful. She managed, though. She was not going to let embarrassment be a reason not to learn something. The herd was in better condition than she'd expected given the financial picture of the ranch. Nathan knew cattle, that was evident. The animals were well managed, properly separated by age, with the breeding stock in good condition. She asked questions, and Deke answered them, and she wrote everything down in her notebook, and they were coming back toward the barn when she heard Al Swanson say something to Pete near the fence that made her horse's ears flick. She'd caught only a word or two, but the tone was sufficient. She brought the horse up and looked at Al directly. "You have something you want to say to me," she said. "I'd prefer you said it." Al had the look of a man who hadn't expected to be addressed. "Just talking, ma'am." "I know what you were doing." She kept her voice level. She was not going to shout. She was not going to make a scene. "I'm going to be here a long time. I'd rather we understood each other now than pretend we do and have it come up later at a bad moment. The ranch has always run fine without—" he started. "The ranch," she said, "has 3 broken fence sections, a supply account at twice fair market rate, a grazing contract that hasn't been renegotiated in 4 years, and a neighbor who's been quietly moving the boundary line. If that's your definition of fine, I'd like to see what you think a problem looks like." Al stared at her. Pete had gone very still. Deke had found something of great interest on the horizon. She dismounted. not gracefully, but completely, and handed the reins to Jesse, who appeared to have materialized from nowhere and accepted them with the expression of someone trying very hard not to have any expression. "I'm not here to tell anyone how to do their job with cattle," she said. "That's not what I know. What I know is numbers and organization and how operations lose money quietly without anyone noticing. I've been here 3 weeks and I've already found 4 ways this ranch is hemorrhaging. If you want to stay angry about the fact that I found them, that's your business, but I'm going to keep looking." She went inside. Her hands were slightly unsteady by the time she got to the kitchen, which annoyed her. She stood at the counter and let the annoyance settle, and then she put the kettle on and opened her notebook and went back to work. Nathan didn't say anything to her about the exchange that evening, but the following morning she overheard, through the thin walls again, which she was beginning to think told more stories than any document, a brief, flat conversation between Nathan and Al Swanson, where Nathan's voice was very quiet in the way that was worse than shouting, and Al's voice was not argumentative at all. She said nothing about it. Neither did Nathan. But something shifted in the arrangement after that, and Al Swanson started nodding to her in the morning the way you nod to someone you've accepted as a permanent fixture. The cattle contract was next. The Billings buyer, a man named Griffith, who ran a purchasing operation and came through the territory twice a year, was due at the end of the month. She asked Nathan everything he knew about Griffith, which was not much beyond the basic business terms, and she spent an evening working through the grade documentation on the herd and preparing numbers to support a renegotiated price. It wasn't complicated, just methodical, the kind of careful paperwork that was boring to do and valuable to have. But 3 days before Griffith was due, something else happened that pushed the contract to the back of her mind. The response came from the county surveyor's office. She opened it alone, at the kitchen table, in the early morning before Nathan was up. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a long time. The original survey stakes for Nathan Cole's property, according to the county records, placed the northern boundary approximately 32 feet north of where the current fence ran along a particular section. Not 8 to 10 feet, 32. She thought about what Deke had told her about the Kimball family and the family before them. She thought about Aldridge's cattle recovery charges, paid twice before she arrived, and the general air of a man who was accustomed to applying pressure in small amounts over long periods. 32 feet, along a fence line that stretched nearly a mile, represented a significant strip of grazing land. Not enough to make a ranch by itself, but enough to matter. Enough that someone had built a fence inside that line on purpose, or let it drift there and then made sure nobody looked too closely. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She started the coffee and stood at the window looking out at the land, her land now, in a formal sense, as of 3 weeks ago, and she thought carefully about what she knew and what she still needed to know before she said anything at all. Nathan came out at first light and looked at her, and she could tell from the way his eyes moved that he'd read something in her posture. "What is it?" She set the letter on the table. He read it. She watched his face. He went through surprise and then a particular closed-down expression she'd come to recognize as his version of controlled anger, and then he set the letter down and looked at the window and didn't say anything for a moment. 32 feet, he finally said. The entire north section, according to the original survey. That's Aldridge. It's possible it drifted over years of fence replacement without anyone intending it, she said, but given his history with the Kimball property, you know about that. Deke mentioned it. Nathan's jaw worked. I should have checked. Years ago, I should have. You were managing a ranch short-handed, she said. You were looking at the cattle and the contracts and the weather. You weren't looking at the survey markers because you had no reason to think anyone was moving them. That doesn't make it better. No, but it makes it understandable. She sat down across from him. Here's what I think we should do. She laid it out. The response letter to the county surveyor requesting a formal resurvey. Not accusatory, just procedural, citing the discrepancy discovered in the existing markers. A letter to the county land office, filing the survey results. A letter to Aldridge's own land agent, not to Aldridge directly, notifying them of the pending resurvey and the boundary documentation. And the cattle, the 2 cows, formally requested back in writing, with the letter preserved. Everything documented, she said. Everything documented, he repeated, but not like he was questioning it, like he was learning it. If he's been working this approach on multiple properties, There may be other families who would benefit from knowing what the documentation shows. That's not our fight right now, but it's worth keeping in mind. Nathan looked at her across the table. The morning light was coming in from the east window, the one with the fixed shutter, and it lay across the table and across the letter between them. And for a moment he looked like a man who'd been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had just set it down, tentatively, to see if it would stay put. "Why are you doing all this?" he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "Because this is my home now," she said, "and I don't do things halfway." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "All right." She pulled the paper toward her and picked up her pen, and the morning moved around them with the sounds of the ranch beginning its day. Deke in the barn, the cattle, somewhere on the north pasture, the wind working at the grass on the south slope. And Evelyn Harper bent her head and began to write. The county surveyor's office sent a man out 3 weeks after Evelyn mailed the request. His name was Orson Pratt, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 assistants, a theodolite, and the expression of a man who had seen many property disputes and expected this one to be no different. He was polite and businesslike, shook Nathan's hand, nodded to Evelyn with the mild surprise that had become familiar to her. The brief recalibration when men realized she was the one who had written the letter and knew what was in it. She walked the north fence line with Pratt herself. Nathan came too, which she was glad of, because she wanted him to see everything she saw and hear everything she heard directly. Deke followed at a distance that was technically respectful and practically within earshot, which was exactly the right position for Deke. Pratt's assistants found the original iron stakes in less than an hour. They were where the county record said they would be, and the fence was where Evelyn had known it would be, inside the actual line by 32 feet in the section they'd identified, and in 2 other sections further east, by smaller but still significant margins. Pratt said nothing when he found the 3rd discrepancy. He wrote in his field book with a pencil, methodically, and Evelyn watched him write and made her own notes beside his. "What's your read on it?" Nathan asked Pratt when they were standing at the easternmost corner stake. Pratt took a breath. "What I can tell you officially is that the fence does not match the survey. What I can tell you unofficially is that iron stakes don't move on their own. Wood fence lines drift, sometimes. Old fence gets replaced section by section, and a foot here, a foot there, adds up over 20 years. But not this much. Not this consistently in one direction." He closed his field book. "I'll file my report with the county land office. You'll have the official documentation within 2 weeks. "In Aldridge?" Nathan said. "I can't speak to that." Pratt looked at the fence line. "But whoever owns land on the other side of this fence will be notified of the survey findings, as a matter of course." They drove back to the ranch in silence, mostly, except for the moment when Nathan said quietly, "I've been running cattle on less land than I thought I owned for I don't know how many years." "We don't know yet how long the discrepancy has existed," Evelyn said, "but we know it exists now." "Because you looked." "Because I wrote a letter," she said. "Anyone could have written a letter." "Nobody did." She didn't have an answer for that, so she let it sit. The Griffith meeting happened 4 days later. Thomas Griffith was a buyer of the particular type that Evelyn had identified from 3 states away. A man who had been doing business long enough to have developed a set of negotiating habits so deeply grooved he no longer knew he was using them. He arrived expecting to see Nathan Cole and discovered, in addition to Nathan, a woman at the kitchen table with a ledger open and a set of handwritten figures on a separate sheet of paper, organized in 3 columns. He took it in stride, mostly. He was a professional, and professionals adapted, but she saw the calculation in his eyes, the quick assessment of whether this changed his position and how much. "Mrs. Cole," he said, with the smooth familiarity of a man who used names as a social tool. "Mr. Griffith." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit down." Nathan sat beside her. She'd talked with him the night before about how she wanted to handle it, and he'd listened and said little, and she'd taken his silence as provisional agreement. Now he sat with his hands on the table and let her lead, which was not a small thing for a man of his generation and experience, and she understood it as such. She laid out the herd data first, grade documentation, weight averages by category, the feed investment breakdown. Griffith listened with the patience of a man who was willing to let the other party make their presentation because he already knew what his answer was going to be. She could see it in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. She got to the pricing comparison last. Your current contract with Mr. Cole prices the herd at 112 per hundredweight, she said. The Cheyenne market closed last week at 119. The Billings market, which is where your operation takes the cattle, is averaging 117 this fall. Something changed in Griffith's posture, not much, a slight forward shift. The discrepancy has been consistent for the past 3 years, she continued, which means that over the last 3 contract periods, Mr. Cole has received approximately $900 less than the market rate for a herd of equivalent quality. She slid the paper across the table. I'm not asking you to pay retroactively. I'm asking for the new contract to be priced at 116, which is still $1 below the Billings average and accounts for your transport and handling costs, which I've estimated conservatively on line 3. Griffith looked at the paper. He looked at Nathan. Then he looked at Evelyn. You've done some research, he said. It's arithmetic, she said. It was all public information. 116 is fair, she said. I think we'd both like to keep this relationship, and fair is what makes that possible. They settled at 1:15 after 20 minutes of conversation that was professional on both sides and cordial on the surface and something considerably more pointed underneath. When Griffith left, Nathan walked him to his horse, and Evelyn heard them talking briefly outside. 2 men talking the way men talked when a woman had just done something that required acknowledgement, but neither of them quite knew how to do it. Nathan came back in and sat down. He looked at the new contract figures on the paper between them. 115, he said. It's $3 more than last year, she said. Applied to this year's herd, that's... I can do the math, he said. But he said it without edge, and his eyes had something in them she hadn't seen before, or hadn't been sure of before, something that looked a great deal like respect. She started clearing the coffee cups. I should look at the breeding records this week. If the herd grade has been improving, it's worth understanding why and making sure we're repeating whatever's working. Evelyn. She turned. He was looking at her in that careful way, and he said, "Thank you." And it came out plainly, without decoration, the way useful words do when a person means them entirely. She nodded. She turned back to the cups. And she did not show the particular complicated feeling that moved through her chest just then, a feeling that was part satisfaction and part something lonelier, the recognition that she had spent her whole life earning statements like that one, and was still, even now, slightly unprepared for them. That was the week Hector Aldridge came to the ranch. He didn't send word ahead. He simply arrived late on a Thursday afternoon, with his foreman and another man she didn't recognize, big, standing back a little, not introduced. Nathan was in the barn when she heard the horses come into the yard, and she came to the door and saw Aldridge before she saw anyone else. He was a compact man in his 60s with a white beard and the kind of tan that came from decades outside. He had the bearing of someone who was accustomed to being the largest presence in a room even when he wasn't the largest person in it. His eyes went to her first and then moved past her, looking for Nathan. "He's in the barn," she said. "I can get him if you'd like to wait." Aldridge's eyes came back to her. He had the good manners not to say what he was thinking. "You're Cole's wife." "Yes." "You sent the letter to my land agent." "I sent a notification of the pending survey to all adjacent landowners." "Yes." "As a courtesy." She kept her voice pleasant. "Would you like to come in?" "I'd like to talk to Cole." "Of course." She didn't move from the doorway. "I'll get him." She went to the barn and told Nathan, quietly, what was in the yard. Nathan's face went through a brief sequence of expressions and settled on the careful neutral that was his version of prepared. He came out, and she came back to the house, and from the kitchen window she watched the 3 men in the yard. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she didn't need to. She'd been watching people negotiate all her life, at county fairs and feed stores and across kitchen tables, and she could read the shape of it from the way they stood. Aldridge did most of the talking initially, and his posture was what she'd have called aggressive reasonable, the stance of a man who was presenting something as an offer while communicating that it wasn't entirely voluntary. Nathan stood with his arms at his sides, which was his version of a closed position. He was listening and not giving ground. The foreman and the unnamed man stayed back. After about 10 minutes, Nathan said something short. Aldridge responded. Nathan said something shorter. And then Aldridge looked toward the house, directly at the kitchen window, directly at her, though she doubted he could see her clearly, and his expression was not friendly. He left without coming inside. Nathan came into the kitchen. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, in the way of a man who had been holding himself together outside and was allowing himself to stop. He wants to settle, Nathan said. Settle how? He'll return the cattle, both cows. He'll agree to the resurvey, and he wants a written agreement that we won't pursue any further claims against the property line discrepancy beyond what the county documents show. She thought about that. He's trying to contain the damage. Yes. Did he say anything about the other families, the Kimballs? Nathan looked at her. How would I know about that? Deke told me, I told you. She watched his face. The same pattern. 2 families at least that we know of. I was quiet. She could see him working through it, the pull between resolving his own problem and the more complicated question of what Aldridge had been doing to others, and the fact that those 2 things were not entirely separable. If we take his settlement, she said, we get our land back, we get the cattle, and Aldridge gets to close the file. If the Kimballs or anyone else wanted to pursue something later, they'd be doing it without the benefit of what our survey showed. Our survey is the only current documentation of how he's been managing these lines. You think we should share it? I think we should talk to the county land office before we agree to anything, and I think we should make sure the survey findings are already on the official record, which they will be once Pratt files his report, before we decide whether to sign anything with Aldridge. Nathan turned his hat in his hands, slowly, the way he did when he was thinking. He had a lawyer's letter with him, he said. The third man. I thought so. She'd seen the way the third man stood. Lawyers had a particular quality of stillness. Did he give you anything in writing? Said he'd send it. Don't sign anything until I've read it, she said, and don't agree to a timeline until after Pratt's report is filed. You think he'd try to get the agreement signed before the report goes on record? I think he's a man who's been very careful about the order of things for a long time, she said. Yes. Nathan set his hat on the table. He was looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between exhausted and grateful, and something else underneath that she still wasn't quite sure how to read. You were watching from the window? He said. Yes. The whole time? Yes. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come. What did you see? That you didn't take the deal, whatever he offered. She looked at him steadily. I was glad of that. He picked up his hat. He stood. He said, I'm going to talk to Deke, and went out, and she let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding, and turned back to the window and the yard beyond it, where Aldridge's dust was still settling on the road. The Pratt report was filed 8 days later. She knew the date it was due from the letter, and she went into Clearwater herself to confirm it had been received at the land office. Nathan drove her and waited in the wagon, and she came out of the land office with a copy of the filed report and a receipt of filing, and she showed them to Nathan without saying anything, and he read the date stamp and nodded once. 2 days after that, the Kimballs came. She didn't know they were coming, neither did Nathan. They appeared at the gate on a Saturday morning, a man of about 50, and a woman about the same age, in a wagon that had seen better decades, with a younger man she took to be a son sitting in the back. The man at the gate asked for Nathan Cole, and was shown to the porch, and Evelyn brought coffee, because she always brought coffee, and because it gave her a reason to be present, and the Kimball man, his name was Robert, sat on the porch steps and told Nathan what had happened to his family's grazing allotment 3 years ago. She had heard the outline from Deke. The actual account was harder than the outline. The Kimballs had been running a small operation on grazing land they'd held since 1878. Aldridge had begun disputing their eastern boundary in 1880, using a surveyor he'd hired privately and documentation that the county had accepted over the Kimballs' oral account of the original stakes. They'd lost 40 acres of grazing land, not enough to make the operation impossible, but enough to make it marginal. The year after losing the land dispute, they'd had a bad cattle season. The year after that, Robert Kimball's wife had gotten sick, and the medical expenses had eaten the operational reserve. They were still there, barely, but the 40 acres would have made the difference. Word got around about your survey, Robert Kimball said. He was talking to Nathan, but he kept glancing at Evelyn, the way people glanced at her when they were trying to figure out what she was and whether she was the person they actually needed to be talking to. The surveyor's assistant mentioned it at the feed store, that you'd found discrepancies. The report is on record at the county land office, Evelyn said. Anyone can request a copy. Kimball looked at her directly now. Would it help? For what we lost? She was careful with the answer. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you what it would mean legally for your situation. What I can tell you is that the pattern the survey documents on our property line is consistent with what you're describing about your own. If you were to request your own survey, and if the documentation showed the same kind of discrepancy, that's different from an oral account. That's physical evidence. Kimball's wife, who had sat quietly in the wagon this whole time, spoke for the first time. We can't afford a survey. The county will conduct one if you file a formal discrepancy complaint with the land office, Evelyn said. It's not free, but the fee is lower than a private survey, and it carries more legal weight because it's county administered. She knew that because she'd looked it up. She'd looked it up in the week between the Pratt filing and this morning, not because she'd known the Kimballs were coming, but because she'd thought there might be others, and she'd wanted to know what the options were. Kimball was looking at her with an expression that was becoming familiar, the specific look of a person who had been carrying a burden for a long time and had just encountered someone willing to help them understand what their options were. She didn't find it comfortable exactly. It felt like responsibility. I can write down the process, she said. What to file, where to file it, what the fees are. It's public information. I'm just writing it down. She went inside and got her paper and pen and wrote it all out in the plain, direct way she wrote everything, and she brought it back to the porch and gave it to Robert Kimball. He read it. His wife leaned down from the wagon seat and read it over his shoulder. There might be other families, the wife said. There might be, Evelyn said. Aldridge has been operating here for 20 years, Kimball said. There are people who don't even know what they lost. They just thought their land survey was wrong and moved on. I know, she said. I can't do anything about every situation. But if people know there's a pattern, if they know the survey documentation exists, they can make their own decisions about what to do with that. Nathan had been listening to all of this from the porch railing, and when the Kimballs left, he stood there for a while in the quiet and didn't say anything. She sat in the porch chair and waited. There was a hawk somewhere above the south pasture, riding the thermals in the lazy, patient way hawks did when they weren't hunting, just watching. This is getting bigger than a fence line, Nathan said. Yes. You knew it would. I thought it might. She watched the hawk. Does that bother you? He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she'd come to value about him. He didn't give reflexive answers. No, he said finally. It's the right thing. He paused. It's going to make Aldridge more aggressive, though. Probably. He's going to come back, not with a settlement offer next time. Probably, she said again. Nathan turned and looked at her. He said it directly, the way he'd learned she preferred things said. Are you ready for that? She thought of Gerald Holt in her family's yard. She thought of her father's ledgers, and the train to Wyoming with her notebook, and the 12 pages of notes she'd taken on cattle grazing and water rights before she'd even arrived. She thought of everything she'd done in the 2 months she'd been here, the accumulated weight of it, the careful document-by-document construction of a position she hadn't had when she'd stepped off that stage. I've been getting ready for something like this my whole life, she said. I just didn't know the specific shape it would take. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. He said, My wife, Margaret, she would have liked you. She looked at him. His face was turned away toward the pasture, and she couldn't see all of his expression, but she could see enough to know it had cost him something to say. I'm sorry she's not here, Evelyn said. She meant it simply. He nodded once. He didn't say anything else, but he stayed on the porch for another few minutes, which she understood was his version of company, and the hawk circled over the south pasture in the late morning light, and the ranch was quiet in the way it sometimes was when things were about to change. Aldridge's response came not through his lawyer and not in person, but through a third party. She hadn't anticipated. A man named Calvin Rourke, who ran the second largest cattle operation in the Bighorn Basin, and who arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with the air of someone delivering a message he'd been sent rather than one he'd chosen. Rourke was about 65, tall, with the particular authority of a man who had been important in the county for long enough that importance had become an ambient condition rather than a thing he thought about. He was not unkind, but he was the kind of man who delivered uncomfortable truths with a practiced smoothness that made them easier to accept, but no less true. He sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and told Nathan that Aldridge was unhappy with how things were developing and that several of the larger operations in the basin were concerned about the precedent of county surveys being used to relitigate settled land questions. The land questions we're discussing aren't settled, Evelyn said. She said it evenly, without apology. Rourke looked at her. Mrs. Cole. He said it with more consideration than Griffith had. He was taking her measure, she could see, not dismissing her, but calculating. Nobody's saying your situation isn't complicated, but there are ways to handle these things quietly, between neighbors, that are better for everybody in the long run. Better for some people in the long run, she said. Some neighbors more than others. Evelyn, Nathan said. I'm not being rude, she said to Rourke. I'm being specific. What you're describing as a quiet resolution would require us to stop cooperating with the county process and decline to share documentation with other affected parties. That's what Mr. Aldridge wants. I understand why he wants it. What I don't understand is why it would be in our interest to provide it. Rourke sat back. He was looking at her with something that was almost appreciation, the look of a man who had expected a particular kind of resistance and was receiving a different kind. The basin community matters, he said. People who push back against the established operations sometimes find themselves without friends when they need them. Are you threatening us? Nathan said, and his voice had the very quiet tone. Not at all, Rourke said. He set his cup down. I'm explaining the landscape. We understand the landscape, Evelyn said. We also understand that the county land record now shows a 32-foot discrepancy on our northern line that has been there long enough to suggest it wasn't accidental. That record isn't going away. What we do with it is a separate question, but we're not going to pretend it doesn't exist. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the table. You're a determined woman, Mrs. Cole. I'm a practical one, she said. He left. Nathan walked him out and came back and sat down, and there was the particular silence between them that had become its own form of communication, the kind where they were both thinking and neither of them needed to rush. He'll report back to Aldridge, Evelyn said. Yes. And Aldridge will do something. We don't know what yet. No. Nathan looked at his hands. Calvin Rourke is not a bad man. He's been in Aldridge's orbit a long time. They do business together. He came here because Aldridge asked him to, and he thought it would work. He's probably not wrong that most people would have responded differently, she said. Differently meaning taking the deal. Or at least backing down. She folded the piece of paper she'd been holding throughout the conversation, Pratt's survey notes, which she'd taken to carrying, and put it in her pocket. We haven't backed down, and now he needs to figure out what he's dealing with. Nathan looked at her with that expression again, the one that had been evolving since the first night in the kitchen, the expression that had started as assessment and become something more like partnership. What do you think he's dealing with? He said. She looked back at him steadily. She thought about the ledgers and the contracts and the Kimballs on the porch and the surveys staked out on the north line and everything she'd built in 2 months out of careful attention and plain paperwork and the refusal to accept that problems were permanent simply because they had been there a long time. Someone who isn't going to leave, she said. Aldridge's next move came not as a confrontation but as paperwork, which told Evelyn more about the man than anything else had. A formal complaint arrived at the county land office 12 days after Calvin Rourke's visit, filed under Aldridge's name and bearing the signatures of 3 other basin landowners, one of whom she recognized as a man named Beaumont, who ran a mid-sized operation south of Clearwater, and 2 she didn't know. The complaint alleged that the Cole property survey had been conducted under irregular conditions, that the surveyor, Orson Pratt, had a prior professional relationship with the Cole ranch that constituted a conflict of interest, and that the results should be set aside pending a review by the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Nathan read it at the kitchen table. She read it over his shoulder. When he set it down, he said nothing for a moment, and then, Pratt, does he have a relationship with us? He came out when I requested it, Evelyn said. That's the extent of it. They're calling it irregular. They're calling it whatever gives them grounds to delay. She sat down. She read it again, more slowly. The language was formal and precise, too precise for Aldridge himself, she thought. The lawyer had done the drafting. This isn't about Pratt. This is about buying time before other families file their own complaints. How much time does a review take? It depends on the territorial office. Could be a month, could be 3. She set the document on the table. She looked at it. They're betting that if the process slows down enough, the Kimballs and whoever else might have filed will lose momentum. People have operations to run. They can't spend months waiting on county proceedings. Nathan got up and poured himself more coffee, which he didn't drink. He stood at the counter with the cup in his hand. Can we counter it? We can respond to it. I want to write to Pratt first. He needs to know this is happening, and he'll want to prepare a statement about the conduct of the survey. And I want to pull the complaint Aldridge filed against the Kimballs 3 years ago, if it's on record. If he used the same lawyer then, the language might be similar. That's useful. He looked at her. How do you know to look for that? Because it's what I would do if I'd been doing this to multiple families, and I wanted to keep the approach consistent and deniable. She picked up her pen. I'd use the same legal strategy each time because it worked the last time, which means if the Kimballs have paperwork from their dispute, which they may not have kept, but they may have, the pattern is documentable. Nathan set his cup down. I'll ride out to Kimball's place tomorrow. She looked up. You were going to suggest it, he said. I was going to ask if you thought it was appropriate, since you know him better than I do. I know him enough. He picked his hat off the peg. He deserves to know what Aldridge is doing. She nodded. She turned back to the paper and began drafting the letter to Pratt. Nathan went out, and she heard him cross the yard to the barn, and she wrote in the quiet of the kitchen until the light got too low and she had to move the lamp. Robert Kimball came back with Nathan the following afternoon. He didn't bring his wife this time, which told her something about the state of things at the Kimball place. Either Margaret Kimball was too tired for another trip, or Robert hadn't told her he was coming, wanting to hear what there was to hear before he brought it home. He brought a box, though. A wooden box. The kind people put papers in when they don't have a filing system but know the papers matter. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside were letters, county notices, handwritten notes, a copy of the original survey complaint Aldridge had filed against the Kimball property, all of it worn, some of it water-stained, the accumulated paper record of 3 years of a family being pushed off land they had a right to. Evelyn read through it carefully. Robert sat across from her and watched her face. Nathan sat at the end of the table and said nothing. She found what she'd been looking for in the 15th document, the formal complaint. Aldridge had filed against the Kimball's Eastern Boundary Survey in 1880, had been prepared by the same Cheyenne law firm now preparing the complaint against the Cole Survey. 3 of the phrases in the new complaint were nearly identical to phrases in the old one. She set the 2 documents side by side on the table and turned them toward Robert Kimball. He leaned forward and read. She watched his face. He read it twice, and then he sat back, and his expression was the complicated one of a person who had suspected something for years and was now looking at the confirmation of it. Same lawyer, he said, same firm, same language in 2 key sections. She pointed at the relevant passages. It's not proof of wrongdoing by itself, but it documents a pattern. If there are other families with similar complaints filed by the same firm, and there may be, that pattern becomes significantly more meaningful to the Territorial Land Office. How would you find the other families? County Land Office has public records of all filed boundary disputes. I can request them. She looked at him steadily. It'll take time to go through, but the Aldridge complaint against us asked the Territorial Office for a review, which means the Territorial Office is now involved. They're the appropriate body to see a pattern like this. Robert Kimball turned his hat over in his hands. It was the same gesture Nathan used, and she'd noticed it before, the way men of that generation managed feeling in their hands when they didn't know what to do with their faces. My wife thinks we should just let it go, he said. What we lost. Move on. What do you think? Evelyn asked. He was quiet. I think she's tired, he said. I think she's been tired for 3 years, and I don't know how to fix that. And if going after Aldridge means 2 more years of this, he gestured at the box of papers, it might not be worth it to her. Evelyn looked at the box. She thought about what it had cost the Kimballs to keep those papers, the faith that the paperwork mattered even when nothing was moving, the stubbornness of a family holding onto a box of documents because they couldn't quite stop believing they'd need them someday. You don't have to pursue the complaint, she said. That's your family's choice and nobody else's. But can I keep copies of these? The matching language specifically. What would you do with them? Include them in our response to the territorial office as documentation of the surveying firm's pattern of complaint filings. Your name doesn't have to be on it. The documents speak for themselves. Robert Kimball looked at Nathan. Nathan said, "Your call, Robert. I won't push you either way." Kimball sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Copy what you need." She copied the relevant sections in her careful hand, 4 pages of it, while the two men talked quietly at the other end of the table about cattle prices and winter feed and the particular mechanics of daily life that men used to process harder things. She worked steadily and didn't rush. And when she was done, she organized the originals back into the box and slid it across the table to Kimball. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He didn't say much else. When he left, he had the box under his arm and a slightly different quality of straightness in his back. Not dramatic, just the incremental shift of a man who has handed something to someone competent and felt briefly the relief of shared weight. After he was gone, Nathan stood in the yard looking at the road, and Evelyn stood beside him, and he said, "Aldridge has been doing this a long time." Yes. And nothing happened to him. Nothing documented enough to matter. She folded her copies and put them in her notebook. That's what changes. She sent the response to the Territorial Land Office 10 days later. It was 18 pages, which was more than she'd initially intended, but the documentation required space. She included the Pratt survey findings and supporting notes. She included the original survey stakes coordinates compared to the current fence positions. She included the analysis of the matching language between the Aldridge complaint against the Cole property and the prior complaint against the Kimball property, carefully framed as factual observation rather than accusation, because accusations required proof she didn't quite have yet, but observations required only accuracy. She included the public land office records she'd requested and received, showing 4 additional boundary disputes in the basin over the past decade, 3 of which had been resolved in favor of parties represented by the same Cheyenne firm. She read it through twice before she showed it to Nathan. He read it once, all 18 pages, and set it down. "You think they'll act on it," he said. "I think they'll have to acknowledge it," she said. "Whether they act on it depends on things I can't control. But the document exists now. It's in the territorial record. That's different from it not existing." He picked up the last page and read it again. "You wrote this yourself?" "Yes." "All of it?" "The arithmetic at the end I checked twice," she said, "because I didn't want an error in the numbers to give them a reason to dismiss the rest." He set the page down. He said, "When did you sleep?" "I sleep." "When?" She almost smiled. "Enough." He shook his head slowly. Not in disapproval, she'd learned to read the difference in his expressions. This one was closer to wonder mixed with something he probably wouldn't have called worry, but functioned the same way. He said, "I'm going to ride it into Clearwater tomorrow. I want to hand-deliver it to the stage office, not just put it in the post." "That's what I was going to suggest." "I know," he said. He rode in early the next morning, before she was up, which was unusual enough that when she came out and found the kitchen empty and the document gone from the table, she stood there for a moment in the quiet and felt something move through her that she didn't examine too closely. The fact that he'd done it without waiting, without discussing it, without any of the procedural back and forth that characterized how they'd operated so far, it meant something. She just wasn't entirely sure what. He was back by noon. He reported that the stage clerk had confirmed the delivery receipt and that he'd run into Calvin Rourke at the feed store. "What did Rourke say?" she asked. He said Aldridge was filing an additional complaint with the Clearwater County Sheriff, claiming our survey process had involved trespassing on his property. She looked at him. "Did it?" "Pratt's assistants were on our property the entire time. They didn't cross the line." He paused. "But the line is what's in dispute." "So Aldridge is saying that our conducting a survey on land we're claiming is ours constitutes trespassing on land he's claiming is his." She sat down. "That's actually fairly clever." "You sound almost admiring." "I'm not admiring. I'm trying to understand his position well enough to counter it." She pulled her notebook toward her. "He's creating parallel proceedings. The territorial office review he requested, and now a sheriff's complaint that creates a local controversy while the territorial matter is pending. If the sheriff finds grounds, even provisional grounds, it puts us in a defensive position on 2 fronts simultaneously. Can he do that?" Create a trespassing complaint out of a boundary dispute? He can file one. Whether the sheriff pursues it is a different question. She thought about what she knew about Clearwater's sheriff, a man named Boyle, who she'd seen twice and spoken to once, at the general store when he'd been polite and careful in the way of someone who was aware of all the competing pressures in his county. Is Boyle the kind of man Aldridge has influence with? Nathan considered. Boyle's honest, but Aldridge is the largest taxpayer in the county. That's not nothing. No, she said. It isn't. She made a note. I want to go into Clearwater. I want to talk to Boyle before Aldridge does. Nathan looked at her. You want to go today? Tomorrow morning, early. He didn't ask why or push back. He just nodded, and she turned to her notebook, and the afternoon moved around them with the low autumn light falling across the table and the ranch sounds coming in from outside. And she was thinking about 18 things simultaneously and keeping them all in order, which was something she'd been doing her whole life without anyone noticing. Sheriff Boyle received them in his office on Friday morning. He was a lean man in his 50s with a careful face and the eyes of someone who was very good at not showing what he thought before he was ready to show it. He'd read the complaint, he said. He was reviewing it. What specifically does it allege? Evelyn asked. Boyle looked at her. He'd been doing that since they sat down, the measured look of someone deciding how to calibrate a conversation. It alleges that individuals acting on behalf of the coal ranch crossed onto Aldridge property during the survey process conducted in September. We have documentation of every position the survey team occupied, she said. Mr. Pratt keeps field notes by practice, and I made my own contemporaneous record. None of the positions were north of the original survey stakes, the stakes that the county record shows as the legal property boundary. Aldridge's position is that those stakes represent a disputed line. Aldridge's position is that a line he's been encroaching on for an undetermined number of years should be treated as disputed when it's documented, she said. There's a distinction between a genuinely contested boundary and a boundary that one party has quietly moved. She took the envelope from her coat and placed it on the desk. That's a copy of the Territorial Land Office filing we submitted last week. It includes the survey documentation, the original county records, and a pattern analysis of prior boundary complaints in the basin. I thought you should have it. Boyle looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up yet. You submitted to the Territorial Office. The Aldridge complaint requested a territorial review. We responded to that review process with our documentation. Before I'd looked at his sheriff's complaint. You hadn't been served yet when we filed, she said. We didn't know about this complaint until yesterday. A silence. Boyle picked up the envelope. He looked at the outside of it for a moment, then set it on his desk and looked at Nathan. Cole, you've been here 11 years. Yes, Nathan said. You've never had this kind of trouble before. Never had anyone look at the property lines before, Nathan said, because nobody had reason to. Boyle's eyes moved back to Evelyn. She kept her face neutral and her posture easy, because she had learned in a lifetime of being the wrong size in the wrong room that the moment you looked defensive, you lost ground, you didn't have to lose. I'll review the complaint and the documentation, he said. I won't be rushed on either side. I wouldn't ask you to be, she said. She stood. Nathan stood. She extended her hand and Boyle shook it, and he held on an extra half second, not in a familiar way, but in the way of someone confirming an impression. They went back to the wagon. Nathan took the reins. He didn't say anything until they were out of town and on the road north, and then he said, He won't file on Aldridge's complaint. Not immediately, she said, but he's watching. He wants to see how this settles before he steps either direction. That works for us, as long as we keep the documentation cleaner than Aldridge's. She looked at the road ahead. The mountains were sharp on the horizon in the cold morning air. We have to be right. Not almost right. Actually right. Because if there's one mistake in our paperwork, that's what Aldridge will use. Nathan drove for a while. Then he said, Do you know that when I came to pick you up in Clearwater, I didn't know what I was getting? She almost smiled. I'd assumed. I thought I was getting someone to manage the kitchen and keep the accounts in order. He paused. I'm not saying that's not what I needed. It is, but it turned out to be more complicated than that. You're more complicated than that. She looked at him. He was watching the road, not her, in the careful way he had when he was saying something that cost him a little. I've always been more complicated than what people expected, she said. Most of the time they considered it a problem. I don't, he said. It was simply said. She looked back at the road, and the mountains were there in front of them, permanent and indifferent and magnificent, and she let the silence sit the way she let useful silences sit, without filling it, without diminishing it. The territorial office responded faster than she'd expected. 22 days after the filing, a letter arrived addressed to both Nathan and Evelyn Cole from a deputy director named Harlan Cross. It acknowledged receipt, but receipt of the documentation confirmed that the prior Aldridge review request had been received, and stated that given the complexity of the matters raised, the Territorial Land Office was dispatching an investigator to conduct an independent review of the relevant land records in Clearwater County. She read the letter 3 times. Nathan read it once. An investigator, he said. That's significant, she said. They don't do that for ordinary boundary disputes. They send a letter with procedural guidelines. An investigator means someone in Cheyenne looked at the pattern documentation and decided it warranted personal attention. Aldridge will know about this. Aldridge will have gotten the same notification. Yes. Nathan set the letter down. Something in his posture had changed. Not relaxation exactly, but a shift, like a man who has been bracing against a door and discovered that the door has started to give. When does the investigator arrive? The letter doesn't say specifically. Within 30 days. What do we do until then? Keep the records current, document anything that happens. And, she paused, I want to talk to the Kimballs again. And I want to try to identify the other families. If the investigator is going to look at a pattern, the pattern should be as complete as we can make it. Nathan looked at her. How are you going to find them? The land office records I requested are still coming in. The county clerk was pulling them when I last asked. It's slow, but they're there. She folded the letter precisely, along its original creases. And I'm going to write to the Cheyenne newspaper. He blinked. The newspaper. Not to make accusations, to ask a question, publicly. Something like, if any families in the Bighorn Basin have experienced unresolved boundary disputes in the past 15 years, I'd like to hear from them, with the purpose of consolidating documentation for a territorial review. She looked at him. People who've been through what the Kimballs went through. They're not going to come forward on their own unless someone asks. They need to know someone's looking. Nathan was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. Outside, Dika was doing something with the barn gate that involved a hammer and more force than strictly necessary, which was Deke's version of carpentry. Al Swanson's voice carried from somewhere south, calling to Pete about something with the east pasture cattle. The ranch moved around them with its ordinary sounds, and she sat at the table with the folded letter from the territorial office and waited for Nathan Cole to finish thinking. The newspaper, he said again, finally. Yes. You think that won't escalate things with Aldridge? Things are already escalated with Aldridge, she said. The question is whether we're escalating from a documented position or an undocumented one. I'd rather be on record. He stood. He walked to the window. He looked out at the yard for a moment, at the barn and the fence line and the land beyond it, and then he said without turning around, When I hired Burke to find me a wife, I told him I needed someone practical. I remember, he told me. I think I may have underestimated what practical looked like. She looked at the back of him, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, looking at his own land. She thought about the first night, the beans on the stove and the list on the table and the wind at the shutter. She thought about how far they'd come from that night in 2 months, not in terms of the things that felt like progress in stories, the warm declarations and turning points, but in the quieter and more durable sense. The accumulated days of working beside someone until you understood how they thought, and they understood how you thought, and the understanding was so ordinary you almost didn't notice it. I'll write the letter to the newspaper today, she said. I'd like you to sign it with me, if that's all right. He turned around. Of course it is. She pulled paper toward her. He came back to the table and sat down, and she wrote the letter with him reading over her shoulder in the particular attentive way he had. And twice he suggested a word that was better than hers, and once she kept her version and explained why, and he accepted the explanation and didn't press. The letter went out on the Friday stage. By the following Thursday, 4 families had written back. She read their letters at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, Nathan across from her, And the letters were different in tone and detail, but similar in the thing that mattered: the shape of what had happened to them, the specific machinery of a boundary complaint filed by a Cheyenne law firm, the survey disputed, the resolution in Aldridge's favor, the acceptance that sometimes the powerful man won and there was nothing to be done. One letter was written in a hand so cramped and tentative that she thought the woman who wrote it, a widow named Ella Franks, who had sold her grazing allotment and left the basin in 1882, had not written a formal letter in years and had sat down to write this one because something in Evelyn's public letter had made her think for the first time that someone might actually read it. She set Ella Frank's letter down last. She looked at it. Nathan was watching her face. 5 families, he said, including the Kimballs. At minimum. She smoothed the letter flat. There may be more who didn't write. People who moved on entirely. People who can't prove what happened and don't want to relive it. This is bigger than our fence line. Yes, it's been bigger than our fence line since the Kimballs' eastern boundary. She looked up. The investigator from the territorial office needs to see these letters. Not as evidence, they're not formal testimony, but as documentation that the pattern I described in our filing isn't theoretical. Nathan leaned forward. He picked up Ella Frank's letter and read it. He read it slowly, with the same attention he gave everything. The careful attention of a man who had learned not to move past things before he'd understood them. When he set it down, his jaw was set. She sold at a loss, he said. Yes. Because of the boundary dispute. Because the uncertainty made the property unmarketable at full value. Aldridge's complaint, whether it won formally or not, created enough question about her title that buyers dropped their offers. She let him sit with it. He may not have needed to win every case legally, just cloud the title long enough that the family couldn't hold on. Nathan said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. I know, she said quietly. How does someone do that? For 20 years? To families who... He stopped. He let the sentence end where it was. Because nobody was looking at the whole picture, she said. Each family thought their situation was individual. Each complaint looked like a dispute between neighbors. Nobody sat down and put all of it in one room. She looked at the letters arranged on the table. That's what changes now. The investigator from the territorial office arrived on a Tuesday in late October. His name was Walter Gaines, and he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with round glasses and the organized energy of a man who had a procedure for everything and followed it precisely. He came with a letter of authority from the deputy director and a leather satchel of documents, and he arrived at their door at 9 in the morning, which she took as evidence of someone who kept to a schedule. She had the kitchen table clear and organized. 7 folders, labeled, each containing the documentation for a specific family or property issue, arranged chronologically. The territorial filing in the center. Pratt's survey on top. Gaines looked at the table when he came in. He looked at her. He said, Mrs. Cole, you've prepared. I thought it would be more efficient, she said. He sat down. He opened his satchel, and they began. It took 3 hours for the initial review, with Nathan present and occasionally asked to confirm dates or locations, and with Gaines taking notes in a precise shorthand she couldn't quite read. He asked good questions, specific, following the logic of the documents rather than the surface of the story, and she answered them exactly, without elaboration, because she had learned that people who asked good questions didn't need padding. At the end of 3 hours, Gaines sat back and looked at the table. You gathered documentation from other affected families, he said. They wrote to us after we placed an inquiry in the newspaper. How many? 4 families with written accounts. 1 additional family I've identified through land office records who sold their property during an active Aldridge boundary complaint. The sale price was approximately 40% below comparable properties in the area. Gaines wrote something down. He said, without looking up, the Aldridge legal firm has been very active in the basin. 7 documented filings in 12 years, she said, all of them in territories adjacent to Aldridge land, all of them resolved either in Aldridge's favor or abandoned by the complainant, with one exception, a family named Prescott, who had legal representation and fought the complaint for 2 years before settling. He looked up. You found the Prescotts. The land office records were public. It took time to go through them, but the pattern was there. Gaines set his pen down. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Mrs. Cole, How long did it take you to compile all of this? The initial survey request went out in late September, she said. About 6 weeks, from the first letter to today. In 6 weeks. I had help, she said. The county land office clerk was cooperative. Pratt was thorough. The families who responded to the newspaper letter were generous with their documentation. She paused. And Mr. Cole was patient with the amount of time it required. Nathan, who had been sitting quietly through most of the session, looked at her with that expression, the one she'd still never quite found the right word for. Gaines picked up his pen again. He said, I'll be in Clearwater for the remainder of the week, reviewing the county records directly. I'll need to speak with the Kimball family if they're willing. He paused. I'll also be speaking with Mr. Aldridge. Of course, she said. This process may take some time to reach a formal conclusion. I know. And I can't promise you a particular outcome. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. What I can tell you is that everything in those folders is accurate and documented. I didn't include anything I wasn't certain of, and I marked clearly the things that are pattern observations versus direct evidence. Gaines looked at the folders. He looked at her. That, he said carefully, is not as common as it should be. He left at noon with copies of everything. She stood at the window and watched his horse go down the road, and Nathan came to stand beside her, and after a moment he said, It's out of our hands now. The territorial process is, she said, there's still the supply contract renewal in November, and the breeding records I want to get through before winter. And the second well, I found a reference in the county land records to a water survey done on this property in 1875 that might tell us something about where to dig. He turned and looked at her. You found a water survey from 1875. In the county records, while I was looking for the land dispute filings, I've requested a copy. She turned away from the window. The well question is separate from Aldridge. It's something the ranch needs, and now might be the time to think about it properly. He stood there looking at her for a moment, the long, considering look that was pure Nathan, the one that meant he was seeing her clearly and deciding what to do with what he saw. Then he said something she hadn't heard from him before, spoken quietly and without decoration. I'm glad Burke sent me your letter. She looked back at him. She thought of everything it had taken to write that letter. The night with the loan document, and her mother's face, and Gerald Holt in the yard, and the train north with her notebook. She thought about how much she had been willing to risk for the chance to do exactly what she was doing now, in this kitchen, on this land, with this particular impossible and worthwhile man. So am I, she said. Walter Gaines spent 4 days in Clearwater before he came back to the ranch. She knew he'd been there because Deke had gone into town for winter supplies on the second day and reported, in Deke's particular economy of words, that the territorial investigator had been seen at the land office, at the county clerk's desk, and once outside the sheriff's office talking to Boyle for a considerable length of time. Deke had also mentioned, without editorial comment, that Aldridge's lawyer had arrived in Clearwater on the same Tuesday, which she took as confirmation that Aldridge understood the seriousness of what was happening. She didn't go into town. She had the November supply contract to finish, and she'd received the 1875 water survey document from the county records office, 14 pages, handwritten, with a rough map of the property's subsurface water indicators. And she was working through it carefully, cross-referencing it against the current well position and the seasonal water behavior Deke had described to her back in September. The work kept her at the table late in the evenings, and Nathan had stopped commenting on how late she kept the lamp burning, which she took as acceptance rather than approval. The water survey was interesting in the way things were interesting when they told you something you hadn't expected. The 1875 surveyor had identified 2 locations on the property with strong indicators of accessible water at depth. The current well was at one of them, which explained why it had been dug there. The second location was in the northeast corner of the property, closer to the grazing land they'd recovered through the boundary documentation, and the surveyor's note suggested it would produce a stronger flow than the existing well. Someone had noted it in the margin of the original document and then apparently never followed up. She marked it on her own map. The second well was a spring project, not a fall one. The ground was already hardening. But she wanted the location documented and the plan roughed out before winter closed everything down. Gaines returned to the ranch on a Friday afternoon, unannounced, which she suspected was intentional. Investigators who wanted unguarded reactions didn't always send ahead. She was in the yard when he arrived, helping Jesse with a fence repair on the south side of the barn, because the fence needed doing, and standing around waiting for news she couldn't control was not something she was constitutionally able to do. She saw him ride in and handed her side of the fence rail to Jesse without comment and walked across the yard to meet him. Nathan came out of the barn a moment later, having apparently heard the horse. Gaines tied up at the post and came to meet them both in the middle of the yard, which meant he wasn't going to make them wait for it. She read that as a reasonable sign. "The county records support the pattern you documented," he said, without preamble. She had decided she liked him for exactly this quality. "I found 6 additional boundary complaints filed by the Aldridge legal firm over the past 18 years, beyond the ones you identified. 3 of them resulted in land transfers that benefited Aldridge Holdings. The other 3 were withdrawn. Interestingly, in each case after the affected family had already spent significant legal fees defending their position." Nathan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "The Territorial Land Office will be issuing a formal finding," Gaines continued. "I can't tell you the full contents before it's official, but I can tell you that the Cole property boundary will be confirmed at the surveyed line, the original line, not the current fence position. The fence will need to be moved." "Our fence moved north," Evelyn said, "or Aldridge's moved south." "The finding will address that." Gaines paused. "The broader question of what Aldridge has done to other families over 18 years is a more complicated matter. The Territorial Office has authority over land records. It doesn't have criminal jurisdiction. But the documentation you compiled has been forwarded to the Territorial Attorney General's office as well." The yard was very quiet. Somewhere behind her, Jesse had stopped working on the fence. "The Attorney General," Nathan said. "The pattern you identified. The systematic depression of property values through strategic legal action, followed by acquisition at reduced prices. That's a matter that falls within their purview, not the land office's." Gaines looked at Evelyn. "The way you organized the documentation, the comparison analysis, the timeline, the financial impact estimates for each family. That's what made it possible to see clearly enough to forward it." She stood in the cold yard and took that in. She had done that work at the kitchen table in the evenings, alone, with her notebook and the county records and the letters from the families who had answered her newspaper inquiry, and she had done it because it was what the situation required and because she was the person in a position to do it. She had not been thinking about what it might reach. She had been thinking about accuracy. "What happens to the other families?" she asked. "The Attorney General's office will contact them individually. I can't tell you what the outcome of that process will be. It's outside my authority." Gaines picked up his reins. "What I can tell you is that without the documentation you compiled, the land office finding would have addressed your boundary and stopped there. The scope expanded because of what you put on the table." He left. She and Nathan stood in the yard after his horse had gone down the road, and the cold came off the mountains to the north in the particular way it did in November, serious and permanent, the kind of cold that meant winter had stopped being a threat and become a fact. Jesse was still standing at the fence, pretending to examine the rail he'd been holding. Deke had appeared at the barn door at some point and was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, looking at the road. Nathan said quietly, "The Attorney General." "I know." "You started with a letter to the county surveyor." "I started with a fence survey," she said. "The letter to the surveyor came after." He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him. And what passed between them in that moment was not dramatic. It was something quieter, the recognition that had been building since the first evening with the beans on the stove and the list on the table, the thing that had been accumulating through every conversation and every document and every long evening with the lamp burning late. It was the recognition that they had become, without quite deciding to, exactly the kind of partnership that neither of them had known to hope for. She turned back toward the house. "The fence needs to be finished before the light goes," she said. Deke made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a cough. Jessie went back to the rail. Nathan fell into step beside her, and they went inside to start the coffee, and the ranch moved on around them with the ordinary momentum of a place that had work to do regardless of what had just happened. The official finding from the Territorial Land Office arrived in December, 6 weeks after Gaines's visit. It was a formal document, 7 pages, with the territorial seal and the deputy director's signature, and it confirmed the Cole property boundary at the original survey line, invalidated the fence position as a de facto boundary, and directed that the encroachment be corrected within 90 days. A separate letter from the Territorial Land Office informed them that Hector Aldridge had been notified of the finding and that his request for review had been denied. She read both documents at the kitchen table. Nathan read them after her. It was a Sunday, and outside the first real snow of the season was coming down in the heavy, committed way of Wyoming winter, filling the yard and softening the fence lines and making the world outside the window a single quiet color. 90 days, Nathan said. That's March. The ground will still be frozen in March, she said. We may need to request an extension for the actual fence work, but we can stake the line before then. He nodded. He was looking at the document, but she had the sense he wasn't reading it anymore. He was thinking about something else. He did that, went somewhere interior while his eyes were still on the page. She'd learned to wait for him to come back. Aldridge isn't going to disappear, he said. The Attorney General's process could take years, or nothing might come of it. That's true, she said. We still have to be neighbors with the man. Yes. She folded the document along its original lines. Being neighbors doesn't mean what he wanted it to mean. He wanted it to mean we were below him, and we didn't know enough to know it. She looked at Nathan. That's over. Over. Whatever else happens with the Attorney General's process, that part is over. He knows we're watching, and the county knows we're watching, and the Territorial Office has a file with our name on it. That changes what's possible for him going forward. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, Deke thinks Aldridge will sell within 3 years. She looked up. Deke said that? Deke said, and I'm quoting precisely, man like that doesn't know how to operate when people stop being afraid of him. Then he went back to fixing the water trough. Nathan's expression was as close to dry amusement as she'd seen it get. I thought it was worth passing on. She looked at the window. The snow was steady now, the kind of snow that would still be there in the morning. Deke is usually right about people, she said. He is. Nathan picked up the territorial finding and set it on the stack with the other documents. The survey, the correspondence, the family letters, all of it organized in the folder system she'd built over the past 3 months. He looked at the stack for a moment. I want to put these somewhere permanent, not just the box I had everything in before. I ordered a document cabinet from the Casper supplier last week, she said. It should come on the February stage. He looked at her. You ordered it last week. Before the finding arrived, I thought we'd need it either way. He shook his head slowly, the way he did when she'd done something he hadn't anticipated and didn't quite want to admit he hadn't anticipated. It was one of her favorite expressions of his, though she had never told him so. The letter from the Kimball family arrived in January. Margaret Kimball had written it, which surprised her a little. She'd had the sense from Robert's visits that Margaret was the one who wanted to let things rest. But the letter was in a woman's hand, and it was direct, and it was not short. The Attorney General's office had contacted them, Margaret wrote. An investigator had visited. The boundary complaint Aldridge had filed against them in 1880 was now part of a formal inquiry. She didn't know what would come of it. But she wanted Evelyn to know that Robert had slept properly for the first time in 3 years the night after the investigator's visit. She read the letter twice. She set it down and looked out the window at the January light, flat and cold and honest, the way Wyoming light was in winter. It didn't flatter anything. It just showed you what was there. She wrote back the same day. She kept the letter brief. She said she was glad the investigator had come. She said she hoped the process would produce something useful for the Kimball family. She said that if there was ever anything the Cole Ranch could do practically, regarding documentation or correspondence or anything else within her capacity, they should ask without hesitation. She did not say, your family held on to a box of papers for 3 years when there was no sign anyone would ever look at them, and that box of papers was part of how this became possible. She didn't say it because Margaret Kimball already knew it, and stating it would have been for Evelyn's satisfaction rather than Margaret's, and she had learned a long time ago to be precise about whose needs she was serving. Nathan read the letter from Margaret before Evelyn sealed her reply. He handed it back without speaking, but his jaw was set in the way that meant he was feeling something he wasn't going to put into words, and she understood that as fully as if he had. Spring came to the Bighorn Basin. The way spring always did, not all at once, but in negotiation, a day of warmth followed by a week of cold, the snow retreating and then reasserting and then finally conceding the lower elevations while holding the mountains a while longer. The fence work on the north line began in late March when the ground softened enough to take posts. Nathan and Deke and Jesse and both Swanson brothers worked the line over 3 days, pulling the old fence and setting new posts at the surveyed position, 32 feet north of where the boundary had been stolen increment by increment over years nobody had been looking. Evelyn went out on the second day. She didn't work the fence. It was physical work she didn't have the specific skill for, and she knew the difference between helping and getting in the way. She walked the line instead, from the eastern stake to the western one, the full extent of what had been taken and was now being returned, and she looked at the land as she walked it. Grass that was just starting to show green at the roots, the way the slope ran, how the water would move in a wet year. The second well site in the northeast corner, staked with a red cloth she'd tied to a post in February, so she'd be able to find it when the snow cleared. She stood at the northeast corner for a long time. Behind her, the sound of fence work. The particular rhythm of post setting, methodical and percussive. Ahead of her, the land the ranch had always owned but not quite possessed. Deke appeared beside her at some point, the way Deke did without particular announcement. He looked at the red cloth on the stake. "Spring?" he said. "If we can get the equipment organized," she said. "I want to contract the digging by April if possible. The 1875 survey puts the water table at 30 to 35 feet here. Cheaper to dig in spring than summer." Deke looked at the ground. He had the expression of a man running calculations in his head that he would not share until he was certain of them. "Better flow than the main well," he said, "if the old survey's right." "I think it is. The seasonal patterns you described match what the 1875 surveyor recorded about this corner." She looked at the stake. "It'll change how we manage the northeast pasture in dry summers. We won't have to move the herd early." Deke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the tone he used for things he'd decided were worth saying, "Ranch is different now." She looked at him. "From when?" "From last fall." He wasn't looking at her, looking at the fence line taking shape to the west. "It's organized. Feels like a place that knows what it's doing." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the fence, at the men working it, at Nathan down the line directing post placement with the quiet authority of a man who knew his land. "It always knew what it was doing with the cattle," she said. "That was Nathan." "Yes," Deke said. He said it in a way that meant, "And now there is the rest of it, and you are the rest of it, and that's what I meant." He walked back toward the fence line. She stayed at the northeast corner a while longer, looking at the red cloth on the stake, thinking about the 1875 surveyor who had noted this spot in a margin, and then moved on, and how that notation had sat in a county records office for 46 years before someone went looking for it. She thought about all the things that existed in records that nobody had gone looking for yet, all the documented potential waiting for someone to sit down with the patience to find it. She turned and walked back to the ranch. The second well was dug in April. It came in at 31 feet, which was within the 1875 estimate, and the flow was stronger than the main well from the first day, which Deke acknowledged with a single nod that she understood as high praise. By May, the northeast pasture had its own water source, and the herd management in dry season was already looking different on paper. She'd modeled it through a projected dry summer, and the numbers showed they could carry 20% more cattle without the midsummer movement stress that had been costing them weight on the animals every year. She showed Nathan the projections on a Tuesday evening. He read them at the table, slowly, with the same care he gave everything. 20%, he said, conservatively. It could be more if the summer is moderately wet. And the breeding program? That's separate. She pulled out the second folder. She'd been working on the breeding records since February, cross-referencing 3 years of herd data against the weight and grade outcomes at sale time, and she'd found a pattern that told her something useful about which of Nathan's bulls was producing the highest grade offspring. The Hereford Cross is outperforming everything else by a significant margin. If we restructure the breeding ratios this fall— I know which bull you mean, Nathan said. I've thought the same thing, didn't have the numbers to support it before. She looked up. You'd already seen it. Felt it, couldn't prove it. He tapped the page. Now I can. She felt something then that she didn't always let herself feel. The particular satisfaction of 2 different ways of knowing the same thing, finding each other and becoming more solid for the meeting. He knew the cattle in the way of someone who had spent 20 years watching them. She knew the data. Together the knowledge was better than either alone, and she suspected this was true of a lot of things between them. She did not say any of that out loud. Nathan would have been uncomfortable with the sentiment, and she would have been uncomfortable saying it, and the fact of it didn't require saying to be real. What she said was, "I'll draft a restructured breeding plan for fall." "All right," he said. The Attorney General's process moved slowly, the way formal processes did, and Evelyn had made her peace with that early on. She received periodic letters from the investigator assigned to the Aldridge matter, brief, formal updates that told her less than she'd have liked, but confirmed that the process was continuing. Two of the other families had provided formal testimony. The financial analysis she'd compiled had been used as the basis for a forensic accounting review of Aldridge's land acquisitions going back 15 years. She didn't know what would come of it. She was not naive enough to believe that powerful men always faced consequences proportional to what they'd done. The process existed, and the documentation was in it, and beyond that she had no control. What she could control was the ranch. So that was where she focused. By summer, the operation looked different in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. The supply accounts had been renegotiated not just with Harmon, but with a secondary supplier in Casper that Evelyn had identified as offering better pricing on equipment. She'd structured it so that Harmon retained the staples business, and the Casper supplier handled machinery and hardware, which was efficient for both relationships. The cattle contract with Griffith had held at 115, and she was already preparing documentation for the fall renegotiation, where she intended to push for 116.50 on the back of the grade improvement data. The Swanson brothers had stopped being a problem some months ago, in the quiet way problems sometimes resolved, not through confrontation, but through the accumulation of evidence that the new arrangement was simply better for everyone. Al still wasn't warm, but he was competent and fair, and she had learned that fair was what she needed from a ranch hand, not warm. Pete had started occasionally asking her questions about the supply accounts, which she took as the most meaningful form of acceptance. Jesse had turned out to be something she hadn't anticipated. He was 21 now, a year into his time at the ranch, and she'd noticed in the spring that he had a particular aptitude for keeping track of things, where the cattle were, what the grazing rotation looked like, which pastures were getting heavy use. She'd started giving him small documentation tasks, asking him to keep the pasture rotation log, and he'd done it with more care than she'd expected and without being asked twice about anything. She mentioned it to Nathan in June. "Jesse," Nathan said, as if confirming he'd heard right. "He tracks things, spatially and numerically. He's not fast with paperwork, but he's accurate, and accuracy matters more than speed." Nathan thought about it. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if the operation keeps growing, and based on the breeding projections, I think it will, we're going to need someone who can manage the herd movement records in a systematic way. I can set up the system. I need someone who will maintain it." Nathan looked at her with the expression she still found the hardest to read. Not the careful one, not the almost smile, but the one underneath those, the one that was quieter and more private. "You're building for 10 years from now," he said. "Someone should," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Talk to Jesse." She talked to Jesse the following week, in the direct way she handled most things. She told him what she'd observed and what she was thinking and what it would involve. He listened with the focused attention of someone who rarely got taken seriously and was paying close attention to the experience of it. Then he said, "I can do that." And he said it without bravado, just assessment. "I know you can," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He nodded. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. It was not a dramatic conversation. Those kinds of conversations rarely were. The first hard autumn came with news from the Attorney General's office. Not a final resolution, but something significant. Hector Aldridge had agreed to a negotiated settlement with the Territorial Attorney General regarding his land acquisition practices. The settlement required, among other things, financial restitution to 3 of the identified families, a formal deed correction on the Kimball eastern boundary, returning 40 acres to their property, and a consent agreement that placed Aldridge's remaining land acquisition activities under periodic review for 7 years. She read the letter 3 times. She sat with it for a long time before she showed it to Nathan. He read it once. He said, "The Kimballs get their 40 acres back. Indeed, whether the land itself is recoverable to what it was, that depends on what's happened to it." She looked at the letter. "But 40 acres on paper is 40 acres. That's something." "And the other families?" Financial restitution for 3 of them. The others, the ones who sold and left, the settlement doesn't cover them. The Attorney General's letter says the legal mechanism for addressing those cases is more complicated and remains under review. She set the letter down. It's not everything. No, Nathan said. Ella Franks, who sold her property. She won't be in this settlement. Neither will the family before the Kimballs. She looked at her hands. They moved on. You can't always go back and fix what was done while everyone was looking the other way. Nathan sat across from her. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. She'd mended the curtain over the window in her second week, a detail so small she'd forgotten about it until Nathan had mentioned it months later, that the curtain was fixed. The stove was well maintained. The document cabinet she'd ordered had arrived and stood against the east wall, organized by year and category. You did what you could do, Nathan said. I know. She looked at the letter. I'm glad for the Kimballs. I'm glad for the 3 families who get restitution. I'm going to sit with the incompleteness of the rest of it for a while, and then I'm going to put it in the cabinet, and then I'm going to get back to the breeding projections. He looked at her. Is that actually what you're going to do, or is that what you're telling me you're going to do? She considered. Both, she said honestly. He almost smiled. The almost smile had been getting closer for months. She had been watching it the way you watch something grow, patiently, without announcing that you're watching. She wrote to Margaret Kimball that evening. She wrote to the Attorney General's office to confirm receipt of the letter and request clarification on the timeline for the deed correction. She wrote a note to Orson Pratt, who had been instrumental in the survey documentation, informing him of the outcome and thanking him for his thoroughness. She had been meaning to write that last letter since December and had kept putting it off, not because she forgot, but because she wanted to say it right, and she thought she finally had the words for it. It was late when she finished. Nathan had gone to bed an hour ago. The ranch was the specific quiet of a working place at rest, the kind of quiet that had sounds in it, animal sounds and wind sounds, and the small, settling noises of a house that had stood through many winters. She sat at the table with the lamp and the last letter and the document cabinet against the wall and the curtain she'd mended in her second week, and she thought about Missouri and Gerald Holt in the yard, and the train with her notebook, and the list she'd made on her first day in this kitchen about the 8 things that needed immediate attention. She had not come here to be happy. She had not known, when she came, whether that was possible. She had come because the alternative was a life defined entirely by what other people had decided she was worth, and she was not willing to live that way. She had come with a travel bag and a set of competencies, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had been underestimated so thoroughly for so long that they had stopped requiring the underestimation to stop before they got started. What she had found, the land, the work, the slow and difficult and real thing she and Nathan had built between them, she had not planned for that. You could not plan for that. You could only do your work and be honest and refuse to become small, and trust that if something was going to grow, it would find its way. She put out the lamp. She went to bed. In the morning, she was up before Nathan, the way she usually was. She had the coffee on and the breeding projection folder open on the table, and a question forming in her mind about the fall cattle sale timing, whether it made more sense to split the herd into 2 sales a week apart, given the grade variation, or to take the full price risk of a single sale with better leverage. It was the kind of question she'd have asked Nathan 3 months ago, and now was fairly sure she knew the answer to, but she would ask him anyway because he knew things about the Billings market timing that the ledgers didn't capture. He came out at first light and stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up from the folder. "Coffee's ready," she said. He came and poured and sat down across from her. She heard him pick up the breeding folder she'd set aside for him, the one with the annotated projections. She heard the pages turn. Outside, the light was just beginning over the mountains, the particular October light that was cold and clear and completely without ambiguity. This was the life she had built, not from sentiment or luck or anyone's charity, but from a letter she had written when she had no other options, and a box of ledgers she had read in the first days when she was still a stranger, and document after document after document laid carefully in the county record, each one a refusal to let the world be arranged by whoever shouted loudest or stood tallest or had the least to lose. She had learned something in this first year that she had suspected for most of her life, but only now had the evidence to state plainly that the people who changed things were rarely the ones who looked like they were about to change things. They were the ones sitting quietly at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a folder of projections and a cup of coffee and a very specific question about cattle sale timing. They were the ones who wrote letters when letter writing seemed inadequate, who read the fine print when everyone else had moved on, who kept going not because they were certain it would work, but because stopping had never been something they were built for. She was 30 years old. The ranch had 50% more productive grazing capacity than it had had 14 months ago. The north fence ran where it was always supposed to run. The Kimballs had their deed. 3 families had restitution they hadn't had last fall. Jessie was keeping the pasture rotation log with a care that still surprised her. Deke had said once to no one in particular while repairing the chicken coop that had given up the pretense the year before, that the place felt like it had a future, and from Deke, that was the kind of statement that tended to be both accurate and final. The fall sale, Nathan said from behind the folder. You're thinking of splitting it. I want to hear what you think first, she said. I think the grade variation makes a split worth considering. But the billing schedule this year, there are 2 competing drives the week after ours. If we split, the second sale might hit a crowded market. She wrote that down. She hadn't known about the competing drives. 1 sale then, but we request the grade separation in the pricing. Ask Griffith to acknowledge the differential in writing. He won't like it. He doesn't have to like it. He has to agree to it. She looked up. He will. He needs the volume. Nathan looked at her over the top of the folder. The October light was in the window behind him, and on the table between them, and on the document cabinet against the wall, and his expression was the one she still didn't quite have a word for. But she had stopped needing a word for it, because she knew what it meant. He set the folder down. 1 sale, he said. Grade differential in the contract. Yes, she said. He picked up his coffee. She turned back to the projection folder. Outside, Deke was already moving in the yard, the sound of his boots on the frozen ground deliberate and unhurried, the sound of a man who knew exactly what the day required of him and was getting on with it. The ranch was awake. There was work to do. She picked up her pen, and the morning opened around them, and Evelyn Harper Cole, the woman nobody had wanted, the woman everyone had been wrong about, bent her head and went back to building the thing that was already, quietly, undeniably hers.